The night over Virginia's plantations was heavy with silence. The fields stretched endless beneath the pale moon, rows of cotton swaying like ghosts, whispering secrets to the dark. The overseers slept, the masters dreamed, but among the enslaved, one name lingered in whispers, a boy who seemed touched by something far beyond the soil and chains. His name was Nat Turner. Nat was born in 1800 on the Turner plantation. From the very beginning, people around him felt there was something different in him, something they couldn't quite explain. His mother Nancy called him a child of prophecy. She believed that her son was chosen for something greater than bondage, greater even than survival. And Nat himself believed it too. Unlike most slaves, Nat was given, or perhaps stole, the chance to learn letters. By the age of 10, he was reading the Bible, its words searing into him like fire on skin. When others labored under the sun, Nat traced passages by memory, hearing them echo in his mind as though the voice of God himself was whispering directly to him. He wasn't like the others. He carried himself with a stillness, a gravity, as though he were always listening to something unseen. Nat claimed to see visions. He spoke of spirits moving through the air, of blood running in rivers, of the sun darkening and stars falling. As a boy, he told those who would listen that God had marked him for greatness, that one day he would lead his people out of bondage. At first, many dismissed this as the imagination of a child. But Nat's visions grew darker, more precise, more impossible to ignore. He once said, "I was intended for some great purpose. The Spirit had spoken to me." The enslaved whispered of him as if he were a prophet. The masters watched him with suspicion. Here was a man who did not only bow his head, but raised his eyes toward the heavens as if measuring his masters against the judgment of God. When he worked in the fields, Nat's hands moved steadily, but his eyes often wandered to the horizon. He was searching for signs. He told others he could hear voices in the rustling of the leaves, in the caw of crows above the cotton rows. Every lash of the overseer's whip only deepened his silence, a silence not of weakness, but of storm-building restraint. By his early 20s, Nat was preaching to other enslaved men and women. His sermons were fiery, drenched in scripture, dripping with images of wrath and deliverance. He spoke of Moses, of the Israelites breaking free from Pharaoh. He spoke of God's justice, of vengeance that belonged not only to heaven, but to those who dared to seize it. His words carried through the quarters at night, when fires burned low and fear hung heavy in the air. And in those words, a dangerous seed was planted. But Nat wasn't just preaching. He was waiting for a sign, waiting for the heavens to give him permission to act. That sign, he believed, came in 1831. He looked to the sky and claimed he saw it, the sun darkening, the moon dripping red with blood. He told his followers, "The time is near. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last." The prophet had spoken. The summer of 1831 hung heavy over Southampton County, Virginia. The air was thick, swollen with heat, swollen with silence. To the masters, it was just another season of profit. Cotton picked, backs bent, whips cracked. But beneath the routine, something was stirring. Something that had been promised for years. Nat Turner's visions had turned darker. He told his closest followers that he had seen blood staining the cornfields, that he had heard a voice say, "The serpent is loosened. It must be slain." To him, it was no longer a matter of patience. It was destiny. Nat gathered a small band of men he trusted. Henry, Hark, Nelson, Sam, all of them enslaved. All of them broken in body but not in spirit. They met in whispers, behind barns, in the thick woods where only the owls listened. Their faces burned with fear, but also something stronger. Resolve. Nat laid out his vision. They would strike in the night, beginning with his own master's house. They would move silently, quickly, sparing no one. The rebellion would grow as they moved from plantation to plantation, freeing some, recruiting others, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. And then, on the night of August 21st, 1831, the sky seemed to crack open. A solar eclipse earlier that year had already convinced Nat the time was near. But that night, the darkness, the stillness, the unnatural calm, it felt ordained. They gathered in the woods. A hog was sacrificed in ritual. They feasted as if preparing for war, not with the armor of soldiers, but with the hunger of men about to reclaim their humanity. As midnight approached, Nat gave the signal. The first target was the Turner household, his own master. Nat and his men slipped through the shadows, their footsteps careful, their breathing shallow. They entered the house. Inside, candles flickered. The family slept soundly, unaware that judgment itself was creeping down their hallways. The first blow fell in silence, then another. The master's family was slaughtered in their beds. Nat believed it was justice, justice that had been long delayed, now carried out not by angels, but by the very hands that had once picked cotton under their command. From there, the band of rebels moved swiftly. One house, then another. Doors were broken, windows shattered, and the sleeping awoke not to the morning sun, but to screams and steel. Men, women, even children. Nat spared no one. To him, mercy was impossible, because mercy had never been shown. The rebellion grew as they moved. More enslaved men joined, some willingly, some swept by fear and momentum. Soon the band swelled to nearly 60 men, armed with axes, clubs, muskets stolen from their masters. They were no longer just a whisper in the night. They were thunder rolling across the plantations. By dawn, nearly 20 white men, women, and children lay dead. Nat pressed forward, determined to strike deeper, to shake the very foundation of Virginia's slaveholding world. He believed this was only the beginning, that other plantations would rise up, that the enslaved across the South would hear the call and join the tide. But rebellion is a fire that draws attention fast. The alarm spread quicker than Nat imagined. Riders galloped through the countryside. Church bells rang not for worship, but for warning. White militias armed themselves. Patrols swept out in every direction, guns gleaming, dogs barking. The uprising that began in silence had now roared into open war. By the second day, chaos reigned. Nat and his men clashed with militias. Muskets fired, swords clashed, blood stained the dirt roads of Southampton. The rebels fought with fury, but they were outnumbered, outgunned. For every plantation they struck, militias closed in from 2 more. Yet Nat did not falter. Even as his men fell, even as the rebellion began to collapse, he insisted, this was God's will. The last shall be first, he repeated, as if each death was another verse in his scripture. By the time the militias regained control, nearly 60 white people had been killed. But the cost was even greater for the enslaved. The rebellion's echo was answered with brutal vengeance. White mobs, fueled by terror and rage, struck back not only at Nat's rebels, but at innocent enslaved men and women across the county. The soil drank blood, far more than Nat had shed. The prophet had sparked his fire, but now the flames were turning against him. The rebellion had burned bright, but only for a few days. By the end of August 1831, Southampton County was no longer echoing with the cries of rebellion, but with the roar of retaliation. Nat Turner's uprising had killed nearly 60 white men, women, and children. But the backlash was far bloodier. White militias, slave patrols, and even mobs of armed civilians swept through Virginia with fury. They killed without trial, without proof. Any enslaved person suspected of rebellion was hanged on the spot, shot in the fields, or burned in barns. By the time the smoke cleared, nearly 200 black men and women were dead. And yet, Nat Turner, the man at the center of it all, was nowhere to be found. For weeks, then months, Nat moved like a ghost. He slipped through the pine woods, hiding in caves, swamps, and hollowed-out trees. The landscape of Virginia, once chains around him, now became his shield. During the day he lay still, the earth itself hiding him. At night he crept silently for food, water, scraps of news. The county was gripped in terror. Bounties were placed on his head. Armed patrols scoured the land, dogs sniffing through brush and marshes. Yet Nat remained elusive. His men had been captured, executed one by one. But their leader, the prophet who claimed he was chosen by God, seemed untouchable. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Nat had fled north, carried by divine protection. Others whispered he had vanished into the swamps, transformed into a spirit of vengeance. The fear of his return was worse than his presence. Every rustle in the cornfields, every creak of the night wind made planters grip their rifles tighter. But Nat was not gone. He was watching. He was waiting. For 2 months, Turner lived as a fugitive. His beard grew wild. His clothes turned to rags, but his eyes, those piercing eyes that had once seen visions of blood and prophecy, still burned. Some nights he prayed aloud, believing even in his downfall, God was guiding him. Other nights he sat in silence, perhaps realizing that destiny can be as cruel as it is glorious. Then came October 30th, 1831. A man named Benjamin Phipps, out hunting in the woods, noticed a strange movement near a thicket. His dog circled, barking furiously. Phipps approached cautiously, musket in hand, and found a crude shelter hidden in the earth, a dugout cave. Inside, crouched low, was the most wanted man in Virginia, Nat Turner. He did not fight. He did not flee. Instead, he surrendered calmly, as though the moment itself had already been written. With iron shackles clamped around his wrists, Nat was dragged from the earth like a spirit being forced back into flesh. The county erupted. The prophet was caught. The rebellion's ghost had finally been chained. White planters rejoiced, while enslaved families lowered their heads in silence, knowing what was to come. Nat Turner was taken to the jail in Jerusalem, Virginia. Behind those iron bars, he waited, for trial, for judgment, for the end. But even in chains, his presence carried weight. Guards whispered that he seemed unafraid. Some swore he still spoke of visions. Others said he simply stared through the walls as though already looking beyond this world. The rebellion was over. The man was captured. Yet the story, his story, was about to carve itself permanently into America's history. The jail in Jerusalem, Virginia, stood heavy with stone walls and iron bars. Behind them sat the man whose name had become both a prayer and a curse, Nat Turner. For 2 months he had lived like a ghost, hiding in swamps and caves, slipping through the cracks of the land. Now he sat in chains, his fate no longer in his hands, but in the hands of those who had long held the whip. The news of his capture spread like wildfire. White families in Southampton County sighed in relief. The nightmare was over, they told themselves. The prophet who had bathed the land in blood would soon be gone. But among the enslaved, the mood was different. Quiet, heavy, some wept in silence. Others whispered that his capture was not an end, but a beginning. On November 5th, 1831, Nat Turner was brought to trial. The courtroom was packed. Judges, lawyers, slaveholders, soldiers, all eyes locked on the man in rags. Turner walked in calmly, his shackles clinking with each step. There was no fear in his stride, no hesitation. He looked less like a defeated rebel and more like a preacher walking to the pulpit. The trial was swift, but it was not ordinary. Lawyers questioned him, demanded answers. Why had he killed? Why had he led men into bloodshed? Was it madness? Was it vengeance? Nat Turner answered with the same calm fire that had guided him all along. He spoke of visions from God. He told them he had seen signs in the sun, voices in the wind, scriptures written in the leaves of the trees. He believed the Lord had chosen him to set the captives free. To his accusers, these words were blasphemy, proof of his madness. To others, they were prophecy, spoken from the mouth of a man who would die, but whose message would not. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty, sentenced to death by hanging. The date was set. November 11th, 1831. The execution. That morning, the crowd gathered early. Men, women, even children came, eager to witness the end of the rebellion. For them, it was not only punishment, it was theater, a public reminder of who held power. Nat Turner was led from his cell, clothed in the same ragged garments he had worn in hiding. His wrists and ankles were bound, but his face remained unshaken. Witnesses later said he did not tremble, did not plead, did not resist. At the gallows, he ascended the wooden steps as though climbing into the pulpit one last time. The rope dangled above, waiting like a serpent. The executioner asked for final words. Nat Turner said little. Some claimed he whispered a prayer, others swore he said nothing at all. Silence. The same silence that had carried him through visions, rebellion, hiding, capture, became his final sermon. The trapdoor fell. The rope snapped taut. The prophet's body swung against the gray November sky. For many in the crowd, it was over. Justice, they said, had been served. But history would not remember that day so simply. The legacy after his death, Nat Turner's body was desecrated. His head severed, his skin flayed, his remains scattered. The system that had enslaved him wanted to erase him completely, to make his memory a warning rather than an inspiration. But erasure failed, because memory does not live in ledgers or records. It lives in whispers, in stories, in the fire passed from one generation to the next. Among the enslaved, Nat Turner's name became both dread and defiance. Some saw him as a prophet who had dared to strike back when no one else would. Others saw him as a symbol of the unbearable weight of bondage, proof that even the quietest man can ignite a storm. For the slaveholders, his rebellion planted seeds of terror. Laws became harsher, patrols grew stricter, preachers thundered louder about obedience. But beneath all that fear, one truth remained. Nat Turner had shown that rebellion was possible. He had not destroyed the system, but he had cracked its walls. In time, his story would outlive the chains, the gallows, the blood. His silence, that final silence, became a language of resistance. And today, nearly 2 centuries later, his name still echoes. Not just as a man who killed, not just as a prophet who preached, but as a question that refuses to die. What is justice when law itself is injustice? Closing line for video: Nat Turner swung from the gallows, but his silence still speaks.